Right, so the United States said it was fighting drugs. The water said otherwise. The first boats went down in September. The reporting counted the bodies. Colombia picked up a fisherman and called the strike an extrajudicial killing. Time put the death toll at roughly 75. Washington kept firing. Bogotá cut every intelligence channel. The United States sent a supercarrier into the Caribbean and called it policing. Venezuela read it as threat and mobilized almost 200,000 personnel now. Defense commands activated, drills launched. The G7 prepared legality questions. Washington trying to steady the frame with a new mission called Southern Spear now as well. Well, the region had already delivered its answer, hadn't it? The operation launched, but the only thing that got hit was America's own position, as it happens. Right, so the strikes began quietly, without any declaration, without detail, without the scrutiny that would normally follow the launch of missiles in international waters. The United States framed them as counter-narcotics operations. The reporting tracked the pattern. The explosions hit small boats across the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. The bodies that washed back to shore did not match the language used in Washington, though. Roughly 75 dead now at the latest count. The number sits in its own silence. The fishermen were among the dead, not drug traffickers. We've seen no evidence yet to prove otherwise. Families recognise the vessels. The US descriptions, though, well, they're narco-terrorist assets, aren't they? Well, the wreckage did not support the label. Colombia read the names. The fishermen did not carry weapons, they carried nets. Their families carried the grief into public view. The government responded with plain language. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, hasn't dressed it up. He's called the missile strikes extrajudicial killings, and that was the end of the diplomatic dance. The line didn't wobble. It cut straight through the usual Washington spin. And then he pulled the plug. Every intelligence channel to the United States shut down in one move. Colombia wasn't going to feed data into an operation that was blowing fishermen out of the water in the Caribbean. There was no translation needed here. The strikes left bodies. The bodies created the anger. The anger snapped the relationship. Washington insisted the operation was built on a counter-drug mandate, though. The Pentagon slid the language into counter-terrorism terminology, like they do. Narco-terrorists gave them reach, you see. Narco-terrorists gave them a legal framing. Narco-terrorists gave them targets. The public saw only the wreckage of fishing boats. The French foreign minister raised the legality of it. France wanted answers at the G7 about what the US was up to. Washington just carried the operations forward. Of course, who did they answer to? The US administration retaliated against Colombia. The visa revocations hit Petro. The sanctions hit officials. The description from Washington accused Colombia of going soft on the traffickers. Colombia described the United States as killing civilians who had not been sentenced to death. Murder, therefore, then. A fisherman became the symbol because his body told the story the Pentagon would not publish. The United States called it a mission, though. Colombia called it murder. The disparity between those descriptions framed the next decisions. The naval build-up carried its own logic. It moved with the pace of escalation rather than policing. The USS Gerald R. Ford entered the Caribbean, the world's largest aircraft carrier, now sitting off the coast of a country the United States has been targeting for years already, chasing that oil under any excuse possible, versus a long-time leader in Nicolas Maduro who will not let them have it. The explanation from Washington was counter-drug operations, so that's what we're expected to believe, but we all know the truth, and abusing military hardware for that aim doesn't change things either. Supercarriers do not pursue fishing boats, you see. It's a little bit of overkill, isn't it? Strike groups do not chase narco skiffs either. It's also a little bit heavy-handed. Caracas read the arrival in the only way possible as the latest in just a very, very long line of threats aimed at them. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez went on air and didn't bother softening it either. He said the mobilization was nationwide, and he put almost 200,000 people into motion. The shift was immediate. Army units moved first, then the Air Force, then the naval groups. The riverine crews have pulled into position. Missile batteries have come online. Police and militia have folded into the structure without hesitation. Civilian units have followed. They tracked the hardware sitting offshore. A supercarrier doesn't arrive by accident after all, does it? And it does rather stick out somewhat. Venezuela treated it for what it was, and the posture's changed. The exercise is stretched across the entire map. Everything that could move has been moving now. Everything that could fire has been readying itself. Venezuela is not a country running a drill right now. It's preparing for an attack it now considered not just possible, but likely. And the structure in Venezuela was able to shift fast, too. Maduro signed the new Defense Command law and didn't leave any space for interpretation in it. The state folded itself into a single chain. Ministries, regions, local bodies, everything pulled into one defense layout now. Military units slotted straight into it. Police and militia were already there. The civilian bodies moved along with them. There's no settling in period. The commands went live the moment the ink dried, and the drills followed. They weren't parades. They moved weapons across the map. They tested how fast a system that size could respond if the threat on the water became real. The pattern looked nothing like routine manoeuvre. It looked like a country preparing for an attack it now considered more than possible. The timeline holds its own shape as well. The US missile strike started in September. Civilian deaths rose. Colombia shut down intelligence sharing. The United States parked its largest carrier in the Caribbean. Venezuela has put 200,000 people on readiness. Questions over legality have rolled in from the E7 aimed at the US. Each move stacked cleanly on the last. And then Washington tried to reset the story, didn't it? Because of course they did. A new operation, a new name. Let's give it a new name, and then everything else will go away and just fold under it, won't it? Let's call it Southern Spear. The language was all force and urgency. The detail was absolutely nowhere, though. No rules, no parameters, no distinction from the earlier operation carrying the same name. There's not even much imagination involved in this. Washington tried to sound decisive, but the message came out completely unfinished because there's no detail anywhere. The presence of the carrier does all the talking. The US narrative, what there is of it, didn't hold under the weight of the numbers. They said narco-terrorists, the dead were civilians. They said enforcement, but the boats were unarmed. They said stability. Colombia called it murder. The bodies matched the outrage. The outrage created the rupture. The rupture cut the structure the US had relied on for decades of control across Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine and all of that. Well, cooperation has gone. Intelligence has dried up. The whole idea of a shared mission snapped once Colombia walked away. The region adjusted in one direction. Colombia treated the strikes as unlawful. Venezuela treats the carrier as hostile, which it absolutely is. I don't think anyone can argue that point. But no one in the neighbourhood took Washington's line at face value. No one's pretending the missiles were policing. The United States escalated with force and with slogans because there really wasn't much to their Southern Spear doctrine at all. The region answered with distance and preparation. The paperwork trailed the consequences. You could trace the sequence without needing interpretation. The US said counter drugs. The region counted bodies. The US said narco-terror. The region saw wrecked fishing boats. The gap didn't close. It just widened. The scale of the Venezuelan mobilization, though, is telling its own story now. 200,000 personnel already ready. Different branches moving at the same time in sequence with each other. Ground forces shifting position, air units repositioning, naval groups aligning, riverine teams pulling into place, missile systems activated, police and militia woven into that same structure along with civilian units following, drills running already across the country, weapons moved, systems tested, timelines tightened. This isn't a symbolic response at all. This is a country acting on the assumption that the United States is going to take the next step. The carrier's arrival lines up with that assumption. You don't shift that much in military assets for no reason. And they're not going to be chasing fishing boats, are they? The strike's lined up with it too. Nothing in the sequence requires any imagination here. Washington is trying to take back control of the storyline with this Operation Southern Spear. The wording aims for sharp edges. The detail undercuts it, though. They reused the name from an earlier operation. They offer nothing clearer than a slogan about removing enemies from the hemisphere. It fell in the middle of a regional backlash that was already underway, that people are already very, very suspicious of, and mostly believe is all about the oil yet again. Colombia has, as a result, severed ties. Venezuela is already now in full mobilization. Legality questions are now piling up. Southern Spear looks like a performance to cover a policy that has lost traction before it even got underway. The United States just pushed for compliance, and it met resistance instead. The missiles hit boats. The carrier moved into the Caribbean. The region watched the outcomes, not the claims. The US kept operating without releasing any verification or evidence of its justification for doing what it's doing. The governments moved according to what they could see, not what they were told. Colombia's suspension changed the intelligence balance. Venezuela's mobilization changed the military picture. Washington called itself the defender of the hemisphere, but the hemisphere treated Washington as the threat itself, because it is. The meaning sits outside the order of events. And the long-term consequences don't need much prediction either, do they? They sit inside the actions already taken. A US operation killing civilians. Colombia cutting ties. The United States escalating further offshore. Venezuela restructuring its defense architecture. Washington announcing a mission with no parameters. The region questioning the legality of that all. Every actor responding with decisions, not statements. The old US-led arrangements depended on consent, though, didn't they? The sequence has erased any of that consent. Washington talked about the hemisphere as its own neighbourhood. But the neighbours don't accept that title. They see only coercion here. They see the bodies of their countrymen They saw a carrier off their shores. They acted on what they saw. The United States keep the operation running regardless, whatever justification they can cling to now. But all the operation has actually produced is backlash. The backlash is producing bigger and bigger fractures, and the fractures have produced mobilization across Venezuela now. The mobilization produces a new balance to this situation. The figures land without help. 75 civilians dead, a Colombian fisherman amongst them. Intelligence ties shut, a supercarrier offshore, 200,000 Venezuelan personnel moving, new defence commands active, countrywide drills, southern spear without consent, legality contested, regional trust gone, no inferences needed to understand this pattern further. Washington simply call it a mission, though. The region call it violence, which is more like what it is. The gap between those words shapes what follows. Washington tries to set the frame, the region tears it down. The water held all the evidence, though, and the events held all of the meaning. Washington can escalate. The region will prepare, and they have prepared. Washington expected obedience instead of that. But what the region is preparing to deliver is consequences. And then, of course, there's Russia in this picture too, isn't there? Already supplying Venezuela with ordnance, as they do. They've now promised hypersonics if the US do actually strike. It's turning into a game of chicken here right now, isn't it? But there can be no possible winners in a war zone. Get all the details of that particular part of this story here. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Cheers, folks.